Malolele, and welcome to our second session today, celebrating Pacific Social Work here on World Social Work Day. And it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists for this session. This session, we're going to be addressing the question of what does cultural competence and cultural humility look like when working with Pacific children and their families. And I'm just going to introduce slightly our guests and then invite them to introduce themselves after that as well. So we welcome today Judy Matai'a, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the Anglican Trust for Women and Children. She was the first female CEO of this agency in its 160 years existence. Judy holds master's degrees in social work and an MBA, both from Massey University and an undergraduate degree from the University of Auckland. She holds advisory roles across Oranga Tamariki, Ministry for Children and Ministry for Social Development, plus other board positions. Judy is involved in governance training for Paspika leaders. She's skilled in non-profit organisations, policy analysis, youth development, crisis intervention, program evaluation, and case management. How's that, Judy? We also welcome today Tuaopepe Lucia Kasiano, who is the team manager for family and community services at Taeaomanino Trust, which is one of the long-standing Pacific social services providers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Lucia has a Bachelor of Social Work from Massey University and a Masters of Professional Practice from Whitireia, New Zealand. She's previously worked also in field education for the social work program at Whitireia, New Zealand, as well as various other social work roles, including Family Start and Oranga Tamariki as well. So welcome, Lucia. And our third panelist today, Malonito Joe Kisona, who is Manager, Learning Planning and Design, Professional Development, Corporate Services, Oranga Tamariki Ministry for Children. So that's a nice long kind of department name there, Joe. Joe completed postgraduate social work qualifications at the University of Otago. And last year, she completed a postgraduate diploma in kaitiakitanga bicultural supervision at Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. She's practiced as a medical social worker, a youth worker in schools, a residence and care manager, and is now an instructional design and delivery for professional development of practitioners. So warm welcome to our panelists for today. So I would like to invite each of you to first just introduce yourself. If you can tell us a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your practice background. I've touched on some things, but there might be other things. And I'd really like you to share with us also the name of one person who has kind of hugely influenced you in your practice and your work in this field of child and family practice, particularly with Pacific families. So I'm gonna head over to Judy for you to start us off.
Thank you very much, Whapte Lava Mole. It's wonderful to come together as Paspika, but more so in the sector that we're so heavily involved in. Like it's almost more than just the job, you know, it's the kind of calling we feel led to. But before we start, Malolele, Malole Soifomoa, Malalangi Lele, o lo ingoa o Judy Matai'a, o le nuu o lo tama I sale mua, ma le nuu o lo tina I mata tufu. So I'm one of 8 siblings. That's a fairly good number for a Paspika family. I'm married to Stephen Matai'a. I have 3 amazing sons, smart, amazing, gifted sons. They drive me bonkers, but, you know, love them, would do anything for my boys. And I have, I don't know, tons and tons of nephews and nieces. When I got the spiel, Trace, it really did make me have to like dive back into the archives of my journey. But I did want to share a little bit about what's kind of led me, because all of this stuff all of this stuff has influenced where I sit in my role currently as CEO. So my first official job was actually here in South Auckland, teaching alongside some young men and women in Paspika circles here, which was the old PS. The PS is the Pacific Island Education Resource Centre. It's been rebranded. And I'd done that before moving to Child, Youth and Family. Actually, it was called Children, Young Persons and Their Family Agency. Then it became Children, Young Persons and Their Family Service. And then it became Child, Youth and Family. And then I left when it kind of moved to Child, Youth and Family. So I was at the Royal Oak office in the mid to late 90s. And I was part of the Paspika team. So that was pretty new in the department back then. Amazing team. We had an amazing Cook Island manager, Akaiti Krama. She was kind of trailblazing back then. And I had the fortunate, I think it's probably why I lasted so long in the department. I'd moved across the Metro Auckland offices to Greyland, from Royal Oak to Waitakere office, and then the National Call Centre. And back then, anyone who was having a baby, we all went to the National Call Centre, and we could work kind of really flexible hours back then. But actually, it was through Child, Youth and Family Services that a wonderful colleague and friend of mine, we went to Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific. And so we were the first Paspika to have been sent from New Zealand to the island. And I know Faye's watching this morning from Samoa. It was Faye Hunt Ioane. And so we travelled to the South Pacific. That's a whole new symposium about my journey to Pitcairn Island. But in any case, you know, that's how kind of social work is evolving. There's more and more opportunities in the Pacific to really showcase, but also highlight the work of social work, the role it holds in our communities. And so really I just, you know, there's life after the department, as many of us know. And so, you know, it led me to teaching at Unitec. My practice leader at the time at Waitakere was Dr. Ian Hislop. So he rings me and he says, don't go back to the department, come to Unitec and teach on the Bachelor of Social Practice, and which was wonderful. I absolutely loved my time teaching at Unitec, and in fact, on my exec team here at Anglican Trust for Women and Children is one of my students. Remarkable young man who I just knew had a heart for community. When he went to Child, Youth and Family many years ago, I was trying to entice him back. Anyway, I got him. He now sits on my executive team here. But that was a really wonderful time for me to really impart a different kind of knowledge back then. And so I've valued every opportunity I've had. And then the role came up here at the Anglican Trust for Women and Children. It's a big NGO here in South Auckland, spans across Auckland. But the point of that was really just to emphasise, Tracy, that, you know, all these different people who've journeyed with me at different points in my career life have impacted me. It was really hard to think of the most influential person. But probably my team, my first social work team, which was Pacific. And back then in Child, Youth and Family, I don't know that it was well received, but we had to really fight for not just resources, but also fight for clients and things that we knew actually the way we worked with clients had to be different, had to feel different, had to sound different. And so that team, all of them, I really do think had a large part to play. You know, amazing Cook Island women, a Samoan gentleman, a couple of them. And that was my first team. And actually, they all helped, you know, just really develop my practice, you know, because I was the youngest one coming in. They certainly made me, you know, understand my place. back then in the 90s, which was, again, that has quite different dynamics in it. But you learn. And so, they were a huge part of kind of surviving the whole social work journey. You come out of Massey University and you're flooded with all this head knowledge, but actually then you start to think, how does all of that translate in practice? So that's my opening comments, and that's who I want to really just acknowledge at this time, having started. Many other people have since helped shape where I've landed right now, but it's probably them that I really want to just honour them this morning.
Awesome. Thank you, Judy. It's great to kind of think back to the history, and how things have changed over the years.
Yeah.
Can we now go to Lucia to share some words of introduction and tell us who has influenced you in your social work journey in this field?
Ia whaftai lava mule nei avanua. Tracy, ia o te whaatalo whātui pa ia mana mangu te tātou mawhatanga, ma whainu tātou whaatasi nei so malo soi fu manguia malangi ma kia ora koutou katoa, malo ni, malo le whakalowhalahi atu. Lisa Bulavanaka, kia ora ana, and warm greetings to you all. Hopefully, I'm sure there's heaps that I've missed, but warm greetings to you all, and happy World Social Work Day. Look, I'm really privileged and humbled to be invited to be part of a panel. I feel a bit, not quite there yet, but I'm happy to be able to share some of the learnings that I've had in my social work journey. So, like Judy, I started my journey back with what was then the Department of Child, Youth and Family, and had been with them for about 5 years until I had my own children, and then, time to move on. And have since worked within other NGO sectors, as well as within the education sector, and currently with Taeaomanino Trust, who I've been with for 8 years. In terms of my own personal space, my family hail from obviously Samoa, and my father, Makesi Stowers, is from Te Whangamanu in Lefanga, and my mother, maiden name is Suafa Stowers, is from Ngai Fulevau in Lefanga. My family have bestowed, and I'm very privileged by it, the title of Tuaopepe, which comes from my mother's side, in Ngangaifu. I'm married to a wonderful man, sometimes, Eti Kasiano, who comes from the villages of Paspika, Levi, Saninoa, and together we have 4 beautiful children who are going through their teenage developmental years, and lots of understanding and reminding myself of what I was like at that age. But our youngest is 8, so I have 3 who are in their teenage years, and then our youngest who is 8, and very much the princess who dominates within our home. I come from a family of 6 siblings, and although I was born in Samoa, I migrated to New Zealand from a young age. So that's, I guess, a little bit about where I'm at. The journey around social work for me, Judy's just taken me through some of those quick reflections. Certainly within the ministry, when you come out of university and you are, keen with lots of fight for your rights, and I'm going to do the work for our people and follow the guidance that my parents have provided in terms of values, and that very hard to do in a system that we're trying to find what your voice looks like in that space. And so over the years, there has been a lot of people who have guided the work that I've done within my social work journey, and the Lord puts people in front of you for a reason, and to be able to support in those spaces. But actually, in terms of my the biggest influence in terms of my social work career is actually from my parents, and the values and belief system that they have bestowed on me, particularly in terms of connection back to our inga, connection back to our villages back in Samoa, as well as, you know, some of the guidance around what raising a family looks like in an environment that is not their own. My dad often talks about his Form 2 education and being able to navigate a Balangi system. You know, with this, if you look at him, he looks like Mr. Miyagi, but sounds like, Samoan is his best language. So, and so, you know, there's been lots of opportunities that he talks about in terms of, you know, working. He was at one point a taxi driver, and he'll come home between the hours of 12 and 2 to watch Days of Our Lives and Young and Restless. And we used to always mock him. And part of that was, you know, going back to those connections of trying to understand a Balangi system and parenting through, you know, how certain characters parented their child. But for me, what that highlighted is not exactly the ideal, but what that highlighted was a want to be able to, a want and a recognition that the life of his children are going to be different from the way in which he was raised, and trying to be able to understand what that looked like in a world that was dominated by, you know, very Eurocentric lenses. So I guess it continues to be the inspiration around the work that I do of service to our ainga and to our communities, but also just a reminder that connections are really important, and that our roles here, you know, always says, and I'm sure other parents say, you know, go get your Balangi education, but remember the roots that has supported you into those spaces. So that's a little bit about me. Say love more, Tracy.
Thank you, Tuaopepe, for sharing that and about your parents and your dad in particular. I'll hand over to you, Joe.
Maloni tatau kainga ko taku ingo ko Joe Kisona ko kumatua kumalo ma hatali le ua na mato hatali ko olokama Paul Williamu ko taku avanga ko Tito Kisona na matua Tito ko Tito Malapai Kisona e taku hama hanau ko taku ngaho e tau ki Malie whare ula a whenga hea moa ma a tahu toke lau. So ko he teilahi mo te awanoa. Hello everybody, my name is Joe Kisona, and like Lucia, I'm 100% privileged and honoured to be invited to be part of this panel, because I look at my esteemed colleagues alongside me and I think, oh man, who am I? so it's thank you, Tracy, for the invitation. My belonging hails from the beautiful islands of Whakalau and Samoa. So Whakalau Atahu in particular, and Samoa Malie Whaleula and Awhenga. But I was raised and born in Puriroa Cannons Creek, which is the biggest city in Wellington. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's in my heart, so therefore it carries a level of truth. And I guess Puriroa is important to me because it was the first demonstration of what social work and community development looked like. So I guess my official career started back in the 90s, which is really, I think, with those that I travel with, I don't think as much. I think it's still very young compared to some of the people that I work alongside, so I acknowledge that. But I think my eyes were exposed to social work at the point of birth. So when you ask the question, who is the one person that inspires you, like Judy and Lucia, I couldn't land on someone, so I kind of went on the space of I come from a lineage of people who have held service at the core and centric of how they raised me. So I saw it in the way in which my parents served not only our family community, but also our wider community within the Cannons Creek area. My grandfather was one of the earlier Tokelau settlers here in Puriroa, and so him and alongside many other Tokelau community family members decided that actually, whilst we're not tangata whenua here within Puriroa, which is where honour goes to Ngāti Tō there, we needed to establish some kind of a hub that helps secure that belonging and therefore the resilience of our people here. So born in a family that held that centric was, I think, the beginning of my interest interest in social work. Although, you know, like most young people, you try and escape what people think you're going to be. So I was told, yeah, you're going to be a social worker. And instead I went down to Otago and attempted to do law. And then I sat down in a law lecture and decided, I don't want to do this. This is actually not floating my boat at all. And ran out of a lecture theatre only to see someone coming towards me. So I quickly ducked into another lecture theatre, and it was a social work theatre. So some say that's divine intervention. Some say that's what happens when your bots just go and study what sits in your authentic self. So I started at Otago University and have been in and out of different roles. At Otago, I realised that I had a love for systems that are supposed to enable good social work. And so I started to find myself in different community development and strategic places where I'm keen to really start to think, well, does that encourage the best social work at the moment? So it's kind of not surprising that I ended up in Oranga Tamariki, especially when in our current climate, let me just say that. So yes, our current climate is an interesting climate, but it's a climate that has me really curious as to how to get the best social work out of people that we're serving and practicing with, our whānau and kāinga. But my career actually started within corrections. That was my first love. I went into the corrections space, a social worker within the prisons, and then moved into a probation space, which wasn't your traditional social work role. But I had a heart for a lot of the young people, in particular child sex offenders that were coming out of prisons, going into communities that weren't established to look after what their need looked like. So I moved into probation services to support the writing of assessments of what our people needed, before then moving into NGOs to support putting in the right programs to support these families who are dealing with these issues that are generally called taboo. So when you have a child sex offender coming home, what do you do? How do you tautoko? How do you support? So that became the base or the centre of what really floated my boat within social work practice. So most of the roles that came after that had a level of that interest for me. So I call myself a bouncer. Anyone that knows me within Oranga Tamariki, I call myself a bouncer, and I call myself that because I bounce in and out of Oranga Tamariki, because I know that sometimes when I find things start to blur and I need to get back to roots, I bounce out and go back to grassroots, go back to things that remind me of who I am and keep myself authentic as possible. But I also bounce into operational spaces. So currently sitting within the corporate services, supporting the learning framing of Oranga Tamariki, of social work, but love to go in the operational spaces. And in particular, no surprisingly, have ended up having a particular love working within the residential spaces of our young people, secure residences. So that's where I've ended up practicing alongside managing spaces like that as well. But I'm really conscious that is a Oranga Tamariki and professional journey, but within my personal space, service has always been that thing that goes ahead of all things. So still serving within both church community development outside of church, alongside non-familial contact. So navigating that space as I can. But yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Okay, lahi.
Kia ora. Thank you all. Yeah, it's just such a rich kind of background and experience, and it's not just about our lives, it's the communities and the families have come before us which inform and give us strength in our current day work. I just reflecting on your stories and your background, what does good social work practice with Pacific families and children look like?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think good social work with Pacific families and kāinga is a spectrum. So if I can say it that way, all good. The spectrum is good wherever you sit. But I think there is a spectrum, because I think on one end of that spectrum there is good social work that is authentic to the Indigenous person that you're working with. So not everybody can be Tongan, not everybody can be Samoan, but if you are and you can work with a Samoan family, then I think that's an awesome demonstration of good, because your start point is about an insight or a position that is centric to the culture, and that's always a good thing. And I think the other end of that spectrum, again, no less or no better, is potentially a position of good social workers being reflexive. And you know, the saying that I once had was, it's a reflexive position coated in a cultural, humble way. So, and I often say that to a lot of people, where I say, it's about recognizing you're not the person that holds power here. You're a person that is part of the solution, but not necessarily the person that holds power. And so whilst that's one part of the spectrum that goes right across, I think good social work is someone that is able to navigate that whole spectrum, can move as they need to, move so that they are a reflection of what the needs are for the family that you're working with. And I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. And I guess an example that I have is when I was asked to support a Taeaomanino family here in Porirua, and I had asked already, what have we done so far? Because no one wants another person coming in to do the same thing. So, and I recognise that being Taeaomanino doesn't necessarily mean I have the answers for Taeaomanino people. So, you know, that whole concept as well. We got talking about the amount of information that had been given, and it was just information, the amount of legal practice that was put into play. So I went and sat with the kāinga, and I asked them, like, I can come here and sit and do nothing. But what do you want? What do you want me to do? I made sure I took someone who was fluent in the language. Unfortunately, I'm not fluent in Taeaomanino. And so I was able to take someone who was fluent, and they started to talk about, you know, in Taeaomanino, and immediately the person that I took was like, no, what about here? And I was just like, no, talk about Taeaomanino. What does that solution look like? So we started from a place of familiarity, safety for them. And from there, my mind was, okay, we could do that. That looks like this. Okay, that looks like that. So constantly shifting the context that I was familiar with so that it started to take shape and look something like what they were familiar with. And what we started to do was we started to build a concept together at the kāinga and I called the toko concept. And it was where we got a social worker, a qualified social worker that wasn't employed by either spaces. And what we did was, my job was to train her in the language of the base organisation so that she then navigated the familial spaces with the kāinga. My job was to work within the base organisation and start to give them the insights of this Taeaomanino family. What we ended up doing was coming to the table, and surprisingly enough, we didn't have a lot to offer. This family had those solutions. They just needed to see that it fit within this New Zealand context, or within this practice context. And so I guess for me, did it fit anywhere in one place of that spectrum that I talked about earlier? Probably not, but it was being able to look for the next right answer and then keep moving. And I think for me, one of those approaches within the Taeaomanino culture, there's a principle called ola hea tala. And to coin a Western phrase to that, to translate it, because it's a huge concept, ola hea tala is just to be in pursuit for the next right answer, not the whole answer, just the right answer that hopefully takes us to the next answer. So it's being mataola to the things that are important to others. I don't know if that to me is an idea of good.
That's beautiful. Thank you. As you were talking, it reminded me of what Lita Foliaki, who was a social worker in, I think, the 80s, and wrote in 1994 a chapter in a New Zealand social work book, Social Work Context in Action or something, and talked about that very same idea of connecting with what was familiar, you know, for the family, for the father that she was engaging with. So it's awesome to hear another to you speak. Lucia or Judy, what would you like to offer up?
Yeah, very similar to what Joe had talked about. Good social work will vary from person to person and what that looks like. But the biggest, I guess, measure for me is that the views and the lens of the clients that we engage with. And so, you know, while acknowledging there is the spectrum, it is in our day-to-day engagement with our clients in terms and interactions around what that could look like for them. And so I constantly think around notions of VAR-centred practice, which you know, Taeaomanino Trust utilise quite often, and looks at the creation of spaces that are not only relational but spaces that are safe. Pacifica is so diverse, and there's a whole range of different lived experiences that our families have. We know in terms of some of the shifts when in terms of the Pacific demographic, particularly around intergenerational differences, and that some of our children are now, a lot of the Pacific are now born within New Zealand. So there's so much diversity in that space that it's hard to kind of define what a good social work practitioner looks like. But one of the key, values that we look at is around recognition of the relational space, the bar in which we're in, and then being able to navigate that or support our families through that pathway. Not everybody with our families, when they're engaged with Taeaomanino or with the field of social work, there's generally an area of, or a sense of vulnerability that comes with them. Comes with families, and it's being able to, in that space, recognise what that looks like for our clients who utilise the services that we are in, and starting a conversation in a space that fits for them. And so when I look at things like cultural competency or a cultural humility, that is guided by where the client is at or where our families are at. Ours is very much to be able to then kind of navigate our way to start the conversation from whatever they've identified as their starting point within our engagement. And I think bar centre practice is one of those ways to be able to do that. In terms of good social work practice, I think there's a lot of not only being able to be familiar with what we are confident in as practitioners around our own theories and lenses, but a recognition that we ourselves are learners in other people's spaces. And it's in that we then be able to, when we recognise that, and as Jo talked about, are reflective of what our role is in that space, there's a whole bunch of richness that comes out of like that talanoa. Often, there are varying definitions of what relationships look like, engagement looks like, all of that. But when we understand it from a cultural, Georgie talked about some of the nuances, from a cultural lens, there is deeper understanding of what that relationship could look like and who the definers in those relationships are. And so for me, there's a whole range of things that as practitioners or as a Samoan practitioner who works for a Pacific organisation, there's a whole range of things that we consider as part of our practice. Some of that is our Indigenous knowledge, but Indigenous knowledge for those that are in diasporic spaces shifts as well. And so, that it comes with learning and time, and it comes with a lot of being able to be reflective in that space of what impact we are making for the people that we are engaged with. And so I know there's lots of work around identity formation and connections, and being able to understand some of that acculturation shifts that have occurred and how people have settled within New Zealand and what that looks like. Sorry, I'm just waffling a little bit. But yeah, I think the key part for me is that we are learning, and we are learning because we are in other people's spaces, and that we have been have an awareness through our reflective practice that we have some tools to be able to support the facilitation, but actually the drivers in that space are our families. So that's just a little bit of my waffling. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you, Lucia. Judy.
I don't have much else to add, Tracy. I guess but those are some really poignant issues that both Sia and Jo had raised. The only thing I'd point to in really thinking about when Paspika people recognise that they've received good social work practice, or that they've been at the other end, they either say the service user end or the client end, is actually our commitment to finding out, so what was it? Tell me, what was it about that person that made you feel like they held you in that safe space, they heard you in that safe space. So while it might seem really basic, there's still so much to be learned in that space when you're Palangi or Maoli working with our Paspika people, or working with the Samoan family, for instance. And I think when you can hear what they tell you about what that was, it's those very things that you know, Sia and Joe talked about. It's how you made them feel, that you listened to what it was that they told you, that you took their lead, you allowed a place for them to drive it. Because often if there's that whole shame that comes over Paspika families when someone has to come in and look like they're going to help you. But actually, you know, it's the old adage of they had the answers before you came, actually. You're a great facilitator, or thank you for listening to me. You know, thank you for being able to reach out to my auntie that I haven't talked to, blah, 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 you know. So on the other hand, it's that real awareness of yourself as the starting platform. And that doesn't end. Like I'm still continually doing that in the journey that I'm in. Because you connect with different people at different places in their lives, at different times of their lives. And you're compelled to have to understand that social structure that created their worldview. So I think it doesn't matter if you put in Paspika social work or you know, Middle Eastern practitioner. And I've got such a diverse workforce here in Auckland that actually it's when you can take yourself and try and understand the other. And Sia talked about it. You know, we carry a whole lot of insider knowledge. That's something that we have huge privilege because we understand the kind of life journey. But I think what good social work practice looks like for Paspika families is anyone that allows that family to be able to talk about their upbringing, talk about what it is that's impacted their lives, to bring to the surface the things that they might be embarrassed about or ashamed about, or this has been hurtful. It's the person that can sit, that can empathize. You know, it's kind of those basic things, but someone who's open, but has already done the first step to saying, actually, I want to know more about you, actually. So I think, and Sia knows this because of the whole Family Start circle, there's a huge evaluation around actually let the client tell you what it is. And at the end of the day, that's really what should determine good social work practice, or you know, in the human services, that's really what should drive practice. And it changes. And, you know, Sia's right with, you know, intergenerational issues and transgenerational issues, they add to that whole emergence of new things that we have to learn about. That's all I wanted to add in that.
It's awesome. Judy, as you were speaking, it made me about sometimes it's just the basic simple things. When we did the research for the cultural humility framework for the children's workforce last year, what we heard from young people, we weren't kind of expecting to hear this, is they were saying, you know, just smile. A good start is just come in and smile when you talk to me, and that kind of simple body language thing, you know, made a big difference for those that worked with them.
Yeah. The other thing just to add quickly in that space is I think as Paspika as well, we know how to recognize the unspoken as well. You know, it's not just what's being told to us. We're actively aware of other things that are happening in that space. So I think we do that better than we give ourselves credit for, is reading those nuances.
Heightened observational skills. I wonder if you can reflect on what do you think are some of the pressing, emerging, critical issues in this field of child and family practice, specific child and family practice?
I might just kickstart, and it was something Jo said in her spiel. it's hard to look at social work practice without having a good systems thinking approach. I think that's become more prevalent in the work that we're doing, is having to train your mindset to think in a systems way. Like that's a whole discourse in itself. But actually, I think how that enables you to start thinking about things even from an integrated approach. I remember, it's ages ago, but that whole ecological model, that they started spieling that off in social work training, but actually the kind of 2.0 of that is the systems approach, is thinking about actually how do you bring yourself and your professional identity into those spaces. I think what's emerging now for many communities is Paspika is no longer just, we have the kind of pluralistic communities that we work in, but more and more it's multi-ethnic. It's no longer, in my own family, if I use it, we have up to 6 ethnic affiliations in just my own family. It's no longer just Samoan. Those sorts of things, more and more, we have to recognize that's part of this emergence and learning how to become more open to what's in front of you. So a lot of that is also thinking about how does that then inform change, the change that you're expected to encourage, the change that you're expected to work towards, if the families don't understand that, or the families can't see that. So some of that is also the skill in which you have to kind of create those opportunities. And it's not new, but the whole journey around child and family social work, it's never done in a vacuum. It's done with the whole family, the ainga poto, the key people in that child's life that mean the most to them. So it might be the rugby coach, it might be the Sunday school teacher, so you have to kind of increase that part of your kite, as it were. So I think more and more that's at the forefront of what we have to do to kind of keep up with just the family units. They're completely different now from my own parents when they arrived.
Thank you. So changing family units, family structure, what that looks like. Lucia and Joe, any emerging critical issues in this field that you want to mention?
Similar to what Judy has spoken about, the shifts that have occurred within the dynamics of Pacific. And, some of the field, that we have people or young people who identify with multiple ethnicities. We have some of the intergenerational challenges that come through as well. But, when we look at things like child development and some of the trends that we're certainly seeing within the Family Start team is the young mums or young parents that are coming through. Some of them in the space of who are young parents who have been raised by a system, and that's the way that they've understood, parenting, and then they're raising their own children, and so it's very, challenging in that space in terms of some of those dynamics, but also in looking at the different backgrounds that people have when we're looking at children and raising families. Yeah, so like I said, in terms of I'll just use them as an example, the young mums who are coming through who may not necessarily have the same connections as we have previously understood what connections with family looks like. And Judy touched on that before. The connections may not be with their aingas that in the traditional sense that we understood ainga to be. It will maybe their friends or somebody who they are connected to who have become part of their ainga. And so they're, So I guess for me, in terms of some of the challenges within the spaces, the different makeups that come through, and then being able to understand what that makeup looks like from the context of the clients that we are working with. There's a whole range of, particularly around the field of working with parents and children. As Judy had highlighted, it does require a whole village support, but as practitioners, it always also requires us to look at things, or to have a view from different lenses. So in that space, when you're looking at parenting, you're looking at both the roles of the mother, the experiences or the ethno-theories that they have in terms of what parenting looks like to them, the experiences that they've had. You're looking at the father and the role that they've understood or may not, or the learnings that they have in those spaces. You're looking at the wider village and what that could potentially look like, as well as, and at the core, you have this baby who's just starting life, all these young babies, children. Certainly that's some of the things that I'm seeing within the Family Start program. And for those that don't know what Family Start is, it's working with those families who have children under the ages of 5. And so, excuse me, my kids are just walking around. And so, yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is being able to navigate the challenges. Some of that are understanding where our clients are sitting, the journeys that they have gone through, the lived experiences that they have. Other parts of that is around understanding a system that has not been fair or equitable to our Paspika, hence the reason why we have, certainly for me, why I'm quite passionate about making sure that our families have support in being able to navigate those systems. Even within my own family, not everybody understands the world that we have come to understand, or the challenges that some of the vulnerable families that we work with face on a daily basis. There's the sort of, why can't they just find a job and do all that kind of stuff, without understanding some of the systemic issues that are continually, keep our people at a distance, or keep our people at a distance. And so some of those things are some of the challenges that we have. We have systems who think that one size fits all, and it doesn't. There are multiple different lenses, and certainly the reason why Taeaomanino Trust was set up was with the vision that we provide an alternative view. Part of that is making sure that our lens comes through and that we're fluid in some of the shifts that are occurring over time, and changing some of that thinking. And that while we recognise that there is a system that we have to work within, getting outcomes for families doesn't necessarily have to be directed from that system. We've got our own ways of being able to work so that our families can see a different type of lens and what that could mean to them. And so I think those are some of the challenges that we have, is having systems that are not necessarily, that hasn't been fair, and continues to put barriers and challenges up. Equally, and I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to say it, as practitioners, we are not immune from that space. Our own development and learning guides or supports where these families are at. And so depending on our own journeys, we influence some of those outcomes. And so that's why I continually talk about reflective practice. Is it about you, the practitioner, and the skill sets that you have, or is it about the clients and some of the journey that they need to take to be able to get an outcome? Often what I see in some of the challenges that our families face is around language. It's around the way in which people communicate. We may be speaking English, but we're not speaking the same type of English when it comes to some of the knowledge base that our families have. They are the drivers, but we as practitioners interpret some of the things. And if our skill is not set up to, is still on that learning journey, then we need other people around us to support and guide us and to give us those alternative lenses. So, there's a whole range of different challenges that is presented, within the field of social work. There's multiple lenses in which we can see what outcomes could look like for our family. There are people that are driving, people who have their own different agendas, KPIs that different people have to meet. I mean, Judy talked about the conversations. Those conversations are driven, for some practitioners, we are challenged by time. An hour's home visit, that's what we'll do to be able to kind of unpack these clients' stories. But actually what we know with talanoa, that talanoa continues on a ongoing basis. We cannot talk about change of or shifts, because the journey for our clients is about a journey for them. That journey goes up and down all the time. And so, if we're in that space, we need to be mindful of what that looks like and the contributions that we as practitioners make in those spaces. So, sorry, that was a little bit about.
Thanks, Lucia. Joe, did you want to mention any emerging critic briefly?
Yeah. I'll be real quick, because Judy and Lucia cover it, and I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm starting to see even more so actually sits with organisations that hire us because we are Pacific and then not have room for us to be Pacific. I think that's going to be an ongoing, challenge until we, the mana that you carry as not only a social worker but as a Pacific person, needs to help drive that room. I think that's been my biggest thing as I've started to observe around different organisations, is that we hire you because you have this thing, another way of being, another way of knowing how we work with our families. So you are Whakalau, you are Samoan, Cook Island, whatever that might be. And then you go and work in that organisation and they actually have no processes, no way for you to share that goodness that you've been employed for. And so your position as a social worker is either to just roll with whatever happens, or raise the critical consciousness within that space. And I think that's something. I know that we've got our family, we've got a lot of challenges you can talk to, but one of the things I start to worry about is when we as Pacific social workers don't raise that critical consciousness, because we need a job too. I don't want to be the social worker that's the troublemaker. I don't want to be the social worker that's calling out that racist policy that's sitting there, especially if you're new to the sector. So I think amongst everything that's been said, I think the organisations that are starting to see the value of who we are as Pacific, their whittle that I put to them is, man, if you're going to employ me for the other knowing that I have and the authentic person that I am as a Tokelau Samoan, you better hope you got room to make so that the solutions that I come up with the families, you also have room for those solutions. And it doesn't start with because the money said here are the deliverables. It can't be. So I just wanted to land that there. Kia ora.
Wow, powerfully articulated, Joe. Look, just because of time, I'm going to combine my last two questions and just invite you to kind of create a response. So there was going to be a question around, I wanted to ask you around how you or your agency see cultural competency and cultural humility and how that's being framed. But maybe you can bring in something from there. But the last question was, what's your best advice you would give to a non-Pacific practitioner working with our families and communities? And maybe to bring in that other question, it could be, what's the best advice you would give to, supervisors, or you've probably already said that, make space, eh? So what's the best advice you would give to non-Pacific practitioners working with our families? And if you can bring in something around these ideas of cultural competence and cultural humility, then go ahead. And this will be our last round, and hopefully we'll be able to look at some of the questions that are coming through. Awesome.
I can jump in there for my two sisters, but Joe, love what you shared, and I just wanted to jump on the back of that, because where I'm kind of sitting in my role now, I've seen that play out. And even in my own appointments over the whole, different roles, I'm appointed because I'm the Samoan that can speak Samoan. Oh, and you can kind of fill the brown quota. I feel like we've gone past that stuff, but I say that jokingly, but I still see it when I'm talking to even my own CEO colleagues. And so part of me thinks, we do the whole 10 steps forward, 5 steps back. You know, it feels like there's a bit of hit and miss in that space. But I did want to just think, you know, that whole cultural competency, it's that kind of perennial concern. It's kind of always there. We've known about that. How do you recognize that actually that the cultural competency that's in front of you is what's valid? Because it feels like that's the whole buzz thing in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years, and it's become it's become necessary that you know how to demonstrate cultural competency. You know how to write that down to get your social work registration, but actually how does that play out in your behavior? And so when I think about one of the things that I don't know if it's not given the kind of validity that it should, but it's that whole social spiritual side. That's the stuff that I think is still missing from the kind of cultural competency, but also cultural humility. When I hear that spoken, people don't know how to take that on board. You know, people who don't apply humility in a way that actually embeds leadership in that approach. And to be honest, I think a lot of my Palangi colleagues don't hold cultural humility in the position that it should be. You know, all of that esteems leadership, and you know, that you're open to being teachable. Like, that's the biggest thing I look out for, even in my own staff. I don't even know if my staff is listening or while I'm in the office, but that's the style that I think we talk about, those resiliency factors. Well, actually, all of that is inside it. It's embedded in the resiliency factors that we've known all along, but now we've just chucked in those fancy Palangi words. But actually, it's the living out of those words that becomes central. What I would say to a new social worker or an advice to non-Paspika practitioner is actually just listen. Just sit and listen. You don't have to jump in and fill the gap. Just be there. Don't take over. Don't speak for them. Just listen.
I would be very similar to Judy in terms of advice to those that are non-Pacific. Be willing to learn. You know, I think, very similar to what Judy said around listening, and to have a willingness to learn and engage in ways that are different, that may step outside of their comfort zone or challenge them. But that's why our colleagues, that's why we have, you know, that's why we have others around us to be able to support and guide in those spaces. So, in terms of that as well, I did want to highlight Taeaomanino. I don't know whether you can see that. Taeaomanino does have their own model of care. One of the team leads who are part of this project is Judy Matai'a, Ngā Whionga ia Whungaono, Inman, as well as Louise Wharepau and our CE Teresa Numerota. And we talk about some of those challenges in terms of competencies and cultural safety. And it's recognising there are 3 frameworks within. I'm not going to go into it too much, but there are 3 frameworks within the TT model that looks at quality assurance, kia tau no te whakakoroanga, and that talks about our own systems within our organisations, how we evaluate our programs, how we check, you know, our own checks and balances within the way that we deliver services. And the literal translation, I understand, is that we are fit for purpose, or that you know, that the service we provide is appropriate for those occasions. The other framework, the second framework that we talk about, is the Takata'anga communication framework, which talks about the way in which we communicate with not only our clients, but with others who access our services or who we collaborate with. There are different ways in which people hear certain messages, Some can interpret it in positive ways, and it continues the conversation. Others may not be ready to hear what the conversation looks like, but that it's important that that we understand what those messaging and how we messaging impacts others or influence others. And VAR obviously is highlighted in that space. And then the final is the Tukalauan concept of Te Manu, which is our cultural safety framework, and looks at its flightless bird within the Tukalauan concept, the nurturing of this bird and how a whole village can care for people, people who are in vulnerable situations. So, or who are needing time to heal or to. And so those are some of the things that I just wanted to highlight in terms of some of that Pacific knowledge, particularly around practice and working with our Pacific children and our families, that Taeaomanino Trust have been working with. And it's part and parcel. So this framework, together all three of those frameworks make up the Taeaomanino model of care. And it's something that we as an organisation live and breathe by, because it's part and parcel of who we are as Paspika. I acknowledge that I'm really fortunate to be working within a Paspika space. And so my conversations are a little bit different from those within the mainstream services. But we also acknowledge that we're in a privileged space of being able to drive some of the thinking because of the ways in which funders at alternative views. Regular services is not necessarily, it's not meeting the needs of our people. And so I just wanted to plant that seed there. Sorry, I know we're over time, just to talk about TT's practice and some of the work that we're undertaking in this space.
Thank you for sharing. Jo.
I'd say really quickly, we're of time, cultural competence within our organisation is about trying to find a measure. What is safe, what is confident, but it's not the end point. So there is a next scaffold with that cultural humility space. Within my own personal practice, I love a very old school community development model, head, heart and hand. And so I often liken it to that. So cultural competence is having the head stuff, that I've got to do this and I've got to do this and I've got to do this. So that's where your hand skill come in. But where cultural humility comes into play, it engages the heart, because your emotional intelligence now comes into play, and it becomes centric to what is my approach to whoever it is. So I can't help but think the cultural competence, whilst it has a place, it shouldn't be the end place. It shouldn't be the destination. And as an organisation for statutory social work, so I'm not only talking about oranga tamariki, statutory social work, understand KPIs, understand that there is a need to measure the way that you practice. But I think cultural humility is where we should be aspiring to 100%, because it is that thing that engages and challenges the responsive environments that you belong to. The question, what would I say? So I mentor for ANZSW new social workers, and it just so happens that all of them are non-Pacific or Balangi or new. And so that was the one question: how do I engage Pacific? What do I have to be? What do I have to do? That was the question. And my advice to them was that, well, for a start, do is the wrong word. You don't do a verb at all first when you're working with our people. And I encourage them to start at a place of curiosity, because when you're curious about something, you don't actually know anything. So walking in knowing stuff is what cultural competence teaches you. Walking in curious, or permanently positioned at a place of curious, has you wondering, but what else and why and what about that? And that's where I think you position yourself to more learning. So that was one of the things that I said to them was, be curious. That's all you have to be when you're working with people that don't look like you and don't have the same lived experiences as you. And being curious encourages them to fill in the gaps. It doesn't give you the right to answer the story. And I guess that's what I would say is position first yourself in a place of curiosity.
That's awesome. Hey, we have come to the end of the time, but I'm going to just invite you to respond to a couple of questions that have come in from our attendees today. Look, someone has written that, there's this phrase, what is good for Māori is good for everyone. And they've just invited a response from our panelists, if there's one, or would like, how do you see that from a Paspika lens?
So I can jump in on that one. And thank you, Faye, for that question. Faye and I have had lots of conversations around this topic. Look, I think what's good for Māori is absolutely good for Māori, but doesn't extend to Paspika. What it does allow is the building blocks to be able to understand Paspika, but I don't think you can kind of blanket the whole approach to being something that will work for Paspika. I think there's a danger in doing that, and it comes back to that whole. We don't want people speaking on our behalf that don't know us, that don't have our lived experience. Different to as we're growing as a kind of multi-ethnic nation. But I think we open ourselves up to some quite serious practice issues if that's the position that's taken across Aotearoa. I just am hugely apprehensive that becomes the discourse for child protection in New Zealand.
Okay, thank you. There was just one other question, Judy, I think that came across maybe to you that you wanted to speak to or a comment. If not, we can finish it up.
Yeah, no, I was just going to comment on that open home question. I obviously clicked on the wrong thing. This is what happens when I have an EA and she does all my stuff for me. I just wanted to say to the social worker at Open Home Foundation, I think that's a wonderful step that your Tongan social worker is connecting with the father and doing those simple things around, teaching the child about their culture, if it's in song or in general language or pronunciation or just even simple terms, great. First step, especially if the child's been in care for a long, long time. And it sounds like there's a transition to reconnect them back to their Tongan side. I think that's a really good move by Open Home.
Awesome. Look, just before we wind up for today, I did want to do another shout out, and that's to Aiolupotea Sina Aiono, who's the Oranga Tamariki Ministry for Children Chief Advisor Pacific. So thank you very much, Sina, for joining us and being part of our webinar, and also supporting your colleague Joe to contribute today. So just to our panelists, there's been some great affirmations that have come over the chat, just an appreciation for what you've contributed today. We invited you because, we are inspired. We honour the work that you do. We know of your work in the community and within our social work profession, and we just want to elevate that and to celebrate that, and also to make this a point of kind of learning and encouragement, not only to Pacific social workers, but to our profession as a whole in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and perhaps in other places of the world as well. So thank you so much, Lucia and Judy and Joe, for taking the time today and for just sharing your wisdom that comes from your story, from your experiences. We hope maybe we can do this again in another form at another time. So wishing you all the best with your colleagues, with your places of work, with your families and with your communities and what you do. God bless you all.